This podcast details true crime cases. It contains adult themes and may contain descriptions of violence. It is not intended for children. Listener discretion is advised.
Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Once Upon a Crime. This is the final week of our Best Of series as we end 8 wonderful years of true crime podcasting and look forward to beginning Season 9 in June. The episode I'll share with you today was very meaningful to me when I researched and wrote it in 2018. It started as a story about a female vigilante who, it appeared, was exacting revenge for women who were found murdered in Juarez, Mexico. Before long, I realized this was a bigger story that had yet to receive much attention in the U.S. In fact, I couldn't find much written about it in English and had to resort to my rudimentary Spanish language skills to translate some source material. I discovered one out-of-print book in my local library about these missing and murdered women. I set out to inform my audience of this little reported case of serial murder of over 500 women that occurred between 1993 and 2011 in Juarez, Mexico, a city that shares a border with El Paso, Texas. There have been documentaries, podcasts, and even a copycat podcast episode released in the years since Once Upon a Crime released episode 87 in April of 2018. If you're wondering about that copycat episode, I've included a link in the show notes with an entire episode dedicated to that sad chapter in this podcast's history. But I digress. But I continue to be proud of the work, the time, and the research I put into that episode. I hope you'll enjoy this excerpt from Once Upon a Crime's archives. If you'd like to listen to the entire episode, there's a link in the show notes. This is episode 87 from Season 2, Last Stop, The Missing and Murdered Women of Juarez. Are you intrigued by unsolved cases? Then you'll want to listen to the podcast Detective Perspective, hosted by Derek Levasseur, a licensed private investigator and former police detective. Each week, Derek presents listeners with a new unsolved case, focusing on those that have not been extensively covered. His fact-based storytelling and professional experience as an investigator make Detective Perspective a must-listen-to podcast, especially for armchair detectives. A new episode of Detective Perspective is released each week on Monday as an audio podcast and on Tuesdays as a video on YouTube. Each week, you'll be provided with facts about the case, and at the end of each episode, you'll get Derek's detective perspective on where the case currently stands and what can be done to solve it. He also provides contact information for the individuals and organizations directly connected to the investigation, and listeners are encouraged to connect with them if they have any helpful information. You may help solve the case. Listen to Detective Perspective every Monday on all podcast platforms or watch on YouTube every Tuesday. Do you know what's better than coffee? Coffee with a cause. Criminal Coffee was created by Derek Levasseur and Stephanie Harlow, the podcast hosts of Crime Weekly. After covering so many cases and learning that in some instances, cases aren't fully investigated due to lack of funding, they decided to do something about it. That's how Criminal Coffee came to be. Criminal Coffee donates a portion of the profits from every bag or box of coffee sold to help fund and solve cold cases using the latest DNA testing technology. They've already raised over $15,000, which led to the solving of the very first case they funded. And if you enjoy coffee and true crime as much as I do, you'll love Criminal Coffee. I consider myself a bit of a coffee connoisseur, and Criminal Coffee is one of the smoothest and freshest tasting cups of joe I've had in a while. You can choose from Criminal Coffee's light roast, medium roast, dark roast, or decaf in ground, whole bean, and K-cups. I'm hooked. I love their medium roast or rogue roast. But if you like your coffee a bit darker, you'll want to try their Alias blend. You'll not only get a great cup of coffee, but you'll also be helping fight crime. What more could you ask for? If you want delicious high-end coffee delivered right to your door, head over to criminalcoffeeco.com and use my code UPONACRIME10 for 10% off your order. Once again, that's criminalcoffeeco.com, code UPONACRIME10 for 10% off. Let's drink some coffee and solve some crime. In the northern region of Mexico, bordering the U.S., sits the state of Chihuahua. Ciudad Juarez, a city that is home to over 1.3 million people, is a bordered town that butts up against El Paso, Texas. In 1993, with the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, the population began to explode. NAFTA, as it was more commonly called, ushered in the world's largest free trade zone. Many U.S. companies set up shop in the border city to take advantage of cheap labor for their factories. Impoverished citizens from throughout Mexico came to take jobs in the factories that churned out products 24 hours a day. Many people working day, evening, graveyard, or overnight shifts were required. Mexican citizens were hungry for these jobs that paid more than they could earn in other types of work, provided air-conditioned factories to work in, and even provided meals. By the early 1990s, over 700 factories, or maquiladoras, were established in Mexican border cities. They employed over 200,000 people by 1994. However, under the treaty, foreign companies were exempt from paying into local taxes, so while the population number swelled, there was not enough housing, childcare, or even basic utilities like water or electricity available. Shantytowns sprang up on the outskirts of the city, where new residents quickly assembled shacks as makeshift homes. Many had no indoor plumbing, and electricity might be shared off a common generator, if there was any at all. Dirt roads miles long led to these communities. There was no public transportation that served these communities, so most of the residents traveled to and from city on foot. Once in the city proper, there were buses, but those without bus fare would walk the entire distance. The assembly line jobs were plentiful, no experience was necessary, and most positions did not require heavy lifting or technical skills. Because of this, many young girls applied and were hired for these jobs. The number of women employed outside of the home in Mexico grew at a rate that had never been seen before. Traditionally, in Mexican families, men served as the major breadwinners, while women stayed home and raised children, and perhaps did side jobs like cleaning, taking in wash, or sewing. Even when more opportunities arose for women to work, the culture of machismo, or men in the dominant power role, prevailed in many homes. It was seen as emasculating for men to allow their wives and daughters to work. In addition, women who wanted to work outside the home might be criticized as loose or sexually aggressive women, who are probably cheating on their husbands. But this culture of machismo also contributed to domestic violence, and by the 1990s, women were increasingly filing for divorce to break free of their abusive partners. Some women viewed these new factory jobs as a way to become independent, to provide for themselves and their children. In some of these single-parent homes, the mothers applied for the jobs in the factories, but in greater numbers, their young daughters took jobs and brought their paychecks home to the family. The younger girls were happy to get out of the home, work, and socialize with others their age. It also provided income to purchase new clothes or go out on the town occasionally. Employers liked hiring the young women because they were quick learners, were often more reliable than male workers, and didn't show up with an attitude or try and challenge their bosses. They also, in many cases, were paid less than male employees. Other than factory work, the only other jobs available for women was working at the bars and restaurants, which were plentiful in the area. As a border city, Juarez attracted a younger college crowd who were looking for cheap booze and nightlife. Cantinas stayed open until the wee hours to serve these customers. Juarez also did a brisk drug and sex trade. Prostitution was legal in Mexico as long as the women were over the age of 18. Other young women were hired at bars, not as sex workers, but to dance and serve alcohol. There were over 6,000 bars operating in Juarez alone. These jobs could sometimes pay more than factory work, but it seemed riskier given the violence surrounding drugs and gangs that was all too frequent at these venues. Juarez had high rates of violent crime, as it was the central seat of Mexican drug cartels. These criminal gangs competed with each other over ownership of the lucrative drug trade in border cities like Juarez. So in 1993, hundreds of girls and young women were traveling alone, often on foot, before dawn and also late at night, to and from their jobs, when women began to go missing from the streets of Juarez. The girls fit a pattern. They were all young, in their teens and early 20s, although a few were as young as 10 or 11, and some over 30. They were all attractive, dark-haired women and girls. Most were morenitas, as they were called in Spanish, girls with dark cocoa skin. How they disappeared also seemed to follow a pattern. They were traveling alone, some on their way to work or school, or on their way home. They were traveling by bus or on foot. They would be taken while waiting for the bus or when they were walking to or from a bus stop. When they were found, most had been raped, brutalized, and murdered, mostly by strangulation. Their bodies were mutilated, either pre- or post-mortem. They were then dumped in the sandy, weed-filled areas outside of town, in vacant garbage-strewn lots or in fields. Their murderers didn't even bother to bury most of them. They were hastily discarded, some within yards of businesses or busy streets. They were left unceremoniously and unapologetically, like someone had just abandoned a sack of refuse they'd been burdened with. The families of these girls were horrified and grief-stricken. The beautiful daughters of Juarez were being raped and murdered. They wanted answers and they wanted justice. Most of them would get neither. When the families reported the missing girls to the Juarez Police Department, they were quickly dismissed. Girls run off with their boyfriends or lovers all the time, they were told. They'd come home when they were done, quote, having a good time. But the families knew better. Their daughters were hard workers and responsible, they said. They had gone missing on their way to class or to jobs. Some had children, and they would not have walked away from them. The police then accused some of the women of being loose. A lot of these girls worked in the bars and nightclubs and lived secret double lives, they explained to their families. They were probably involved in drugs, they said. They said that some of them were, quote, probably prostitutes who didn't want to come home or had gotten involved with a drug dealer and were partying and didn't want their families to know. Their mothers and fathers were furious. The police didn't even act interested enough to investigate. They told them to go home and wait, and their daughters would come home eventually. When they couldn't get the Juarez police to take them seriously, some traveled to the state police department to report the disappearances. The local police were not trained to conduct criminal investigations, but they could have reported the missing women to the state police and asked for help. Instead, the families had to do it themselves. A mother of one of the missing girls reported that she didn't get much help from the state police either. When she tried to file a report explaining that her daughter went missing several days earlier, and she'd been searching without luck and without help from the Juarez police, the officer began to question her. Did her daughter have a boyfriend? Did she dress in miniskirts? Angrily, she answered no. But why was he asking her that before he'd even asked where she was last seen or other relevant details? She was, again, quickly dismissed. Her daughter probably went off with some guy, he said, and he smirked at her, as if privy to some dirty secret about her missing child. Invariably, days, weeks, or months after the women disappeared, they would be found murdered and left to rot in a field or empty lot. In 1994, no less than 10 bodies of young women were found within the Juarez city limits. Still, no movement was made to solve these crimes. Just like the murderers had discarded them like so much trash, the authorities also seemed to look upon the women of Juarez as disposable. Even after women began turning up dead, police continued to not take the reported disappearances seriously. They would say that they ran off with a boyfriend or were hanging out with drug dealers. Some would insinuate or downright accuse the women of being sex workers or drug addicts without any facts to support such statements. In their mind, labeling the women as loose gave them permission to dismiss them out of hand. While some officers engaged in victim blaming, painting the women as responsible for their own murders due to their life choices, their mothers pointed out that a few of the murdered girls were prepubescent, only 10 or 11 years old. How did the police explain this, they asked. The finger was then pointed at the parents, particularly the mothers. They would say it was obvious that their mothers weren't caring for them correctly. The girls probably turned to others for care and attention, and that's why they could be taken advantage of. It was a sickening cycle of blame that never placed responsibility on the actual perpetrators who were committing these atrocious acts. Perhaps others saw that there was no consequences to raping and killing women in Juarez, and took that as permission to violently attack more young women. By September of 1995, more than 40 women had been murdered in Ciudad Juarez. Still, there were no arrests or even real suspects. Thanks once again for listening. To find out the rest of this story, you can grab a link in the show notes or look for episode 87 from season 2 of Once Upon a Crime wherever you listen to podcasts. There's so much more to this story and many questions still to be answered. Was it a serial killer at work in Juarez? Was this the work of drug cartels or sex traffickers? The investigation into the hundreds of women who went missing or were found murdered, their bodies dumped outside of Juarez, would take many twists and turns. The truth would be even more sinister than you might think. In the show notes, you'll also find links for our sponsors, Patreon page, and CrimeCon Nashville with our discount codes. I'll be rolling out the last best of episodes on Friday, May 24th, and then I'll be off for Memorial Day. That week, I'll be winging off to Nashville for CrimeCon, and I hope to see you there. And if you are there, make sure to stop by my booth on Podcast Row. Come and say hi, grab some merch, and you'll get access to an exclusive new episode of Once Upon a Crime. You'll be able to listen to our first episode of Season 9 2 weeks before everyone else. But you can only get it early if you're in Nashville for CrimeCon weekend. Once Upon a Crime was written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez-Ludlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia. Until next time, be good to one another.